Watch Ben Shapiro cherry pick and misrepresent data as if we can't type one question into Google, just so we can say feminism bad. Yeah, you see radical feminism on campus, but that's because college kids don't know what they're talking about, which is why it's so easy to destroy them with facts and logic.
You talked about divorce rates and how divorce rates have been increasing in this country since the 1970s, and just kind of alluded to that as evidence of the failure of radical feminism.
Well, they sort of leveled off since like the 2000s, like the early 2000s. But yes, they're still higher than they were in the 50s and 40s.
Right.
Here we see the thesis unfold. The claim is that radical feminism caused divorce rates to increase. While Ben does say that rates have leveled off, I'll give him credit for that, he fails to mention that there was a massive spike in the 60s with a steady decline until the early 2000s. Are we less feminist than in the 60s? Already the premise falls apart statistically, and he had to obfuscate anyway.
Couldn't that also simply be because of the fact that women are now more socioeconomically able to be independent than men? Like, how can you say that radical feminism caused divorces and also ignore the fact that possibly it was just that women became able to be independent, therefore they started to divorce more?
All right, so now there's two issues with this guy's question. Women are more or less equally independent as men, but I get what he's saying, economic independence as a factor in divorce. The context is key to understanding this factor because its effect changes over time. The initial spike in divorce was contributed to by socioeconomic opportunities for independence, but primarily by no-fault divorces becoming law. We can see that the more economic opportunities where no-fault divorces became law, the more divorce we saw. But today, socioeconomic independence correlates strongly with less divorce. It's funny because the college-educated are more likely to be feminists, yet another nail in the coffin for Shapiro's hypothesis.
Because they would be becoming economically independent in the same period as they were getting divorced, as they were getting married. Meaning that these aren't 20-year marriages that are breaking up. These are like 5-year marriages that are breaking up.
That wasn't very clear to me the first time I heard it, but basically what he's saying is that if it were economic, we would see an initial spike across the board as women became economically independent, not just younger marriages. But there are a few major issues with this analysis. First is that divorce rates are larger for younger marriages in general, for many reasons, including dissatisfaction being much higher. And when a legal and economic pathway opened the floodgates for unhappy couples, we saw a giant wave of divorce. Second is that older women had fewer economic and education opportunities, so that doesn't help. Third is that older women in this time period faced a stronger stigma and negative attitude towards divorce, but that isn't necessarily a good thing. When divorce is not an option, women in harmful marriages often rely on value-based rationalizations to endure their circumstances, interpreting suffering as duty or virtue. For some, this shift opens the door to reevaluation and freedom, but for others, it provokes a defensive doubling down on values, since admitting regret would mean confronting the weight of years already endured as avoidable suffering, which is extremely painful.
Which suggests to me a mental shift that's taken place in the nature of how we think about marriage, rather than socioeconomic status being the indicator.
While it may be true that there has been a shift in the attitude toward marriage, I wouldn't exactly credit radical feminism. Material conditions and the subsequent societal changes with regard to gender roles and so on changed marriage's roles in people's lives. If it were feminism, then the college-educated feminists would divorce more, and the more traditional working class would divorce less. Instead, we see the opposite. Traditional conservative marriages often uphold attitudes that developed from necessity. For example, without birth control, promiscuity held significantly more risks, making it more taboo. People shouldn't feel free to do anything they want, but to force certain attitudes that don't align with the reality we live in to socially restrict freedoms, like how one can share responsibilities with their spouse or choose their own path in life, that will cause significant conflict. This can also contribute to divorce. What we're seeing now is opposing pressures for men and women to embrace and reject traditional values. This is for another video, but I've noticed that while at its best, feminism advocates for expanding the acceptable roles for women, I only see efforts to either enforce or vilify traditional masculine roles for men. Let me know in the comments if that's something you're interested in, and if you like these types of discussions, subscribe so you might see your ideas in the next video.
Meaning that I suppose that economics could tie into this, except for the fact that people who are higher income tend to stay married more often than people who are lower income.
That is true only after the initial wave of divorces. Now, women who grow up with opportunities that are college educated, more liberal, and more wealthy marry later and more selectively. This causes a decrease in divorce. So instead of divorce rates being low because there was no other option, they're low due to freedom of choice. This attempt to interchangeably use the context of the 60s and 2000s is at best a very careless oversight, if I'm being charitable.
Right, so that sort of undercuts the argument a little bit. Meaning that if you're richer, you tend to be married longer on average. People who are poorer tend to get divorced more
Where did
often.
you get that statistical
The
trend
Census
from?
Bureau.
That's awesome. I get my stats from the exact same place. So let's recap. Divorce rates actually increased because of no-fault divorces. Better economic opportunities for women initially increased divorce, while better economic status later decreased divorce. And if radical feminism was the primary factor, we would see a steady increase in divorce. We don't. College education would indicate higher divorce rates. It doesn't. And the same trend in divorce wouldn't be seen across Western countries. But it is. The thing is, marriage and divorce rates is complex and multivariate. It would actually be pretty funny if every divorce filing just listed the patriarchy as the reason for separation. Overall, Ben is desperate for some ideological boogeyman to scare people. And somehow the conclusion is voting for a twice-divorced serial adulterer with a perverted disposition toward young girls for president. Riddle me that.